I just saw your debrief about reaching mechanics. And I was talking with a colleague, and we have one doubt. He said that if you reach overhead, you will compress the upper thorax naturally due to the upward rotation of the scapula. Plus, when you add load, which is compression, you will further induce compression. But on your debrief, you said reaching overhead facilitates T2 to T4 expansion. Do the mechanics differ under load? Thank you. Great question. So I would disagree with your colleague on one piece, but I would agree with him on another piece. Stay tuned because I'll piece that out for you. When I go overhead, the resting position of the scapula, if you look at the Ludwig article, which she's about as boss as it gets when it comes to any research of the shoulder, so check her out and I'll link that study in the show notes. The resting position of the scapula is about 41 degrees of internal rotation with about 5 degrees, I believe, of upward rotation and a slight anterior tip. And in that position, if I breathe in, I'm going to have the ability to expand, or I'm going to have eccentric bias of the posterior thorax. And that's going to stay consistent for about the first 60 degrees of shoulder flexion. So in this situation, you will get some ability to expand the upper thorax, or the posterior thorax. Now, because I'm not in full upward rotation, there's going to be some relative concentric bias of the downward rotators. So you may not get as much expansion in the upper part of the thorax, T2 to T4. Now here's where your friend is talking. So he's saying, as you now initiate upward rotation, which is 60 degrees and beyond, you get a concomitant external rotation of the scapula. So that's going to create some compression or concentric bias in the posterior thorax. That doesn't mean that it's completely sealed off, though. Because remember, I'm starting from a 41 degree internal rotation bias. So I'm going to have some degree of compression or concentric bias in the upper thorax, limiting my ability to expand. Now here's the interesting thing when we're talking about scapulohumeral rhythm. Once you hit about 120 and you go all the way to 180 overhead, you're definitely getting progressive external rotation and upward rotation. But interestingly enough, you got two things going on here. You have an increase in humeral external rotation. If I have external rotation of the humerus, boom, I'm going to have a relative internal rotation at the scapula. That's because your external rotators create internal rotation at the scap. That's piece one. Piece two, when you hit full overhead, the scapula, because it's sliding along the lateral aspect of the rib cage, orients into the scapular plane, which is about 45 degrees from abduction forward. It's like a midpoint between flexion and abduction. That angle actually biases internal rotation of the scapula, even though the movement is external rotation and compression of the lateral rib cage. So that's going to give you some posterior expansion. The other piece here is as I upwardly rotate the scapula, the downward rotators now become more eccentrically biased. The ones in the back are your rhomboids. Those run from C7 to T5. So that's going to allow for some expansion into those segments of the rib cage. And the thing we want to be careful with on this is we're talking about gradients. This isn't on-off switches. So it isn't, okay, from 0 to 60, I get the most posterior expansion from T6 to T12 as humanly possible, and then as soon as I hit 61, boom, it shuts off. It's not that. It's gradients. Some people can still get some posterior expansion there. Someone who is super flat in the thoracic spine, you're going to have a bad time. Same thing as I'm going to fully overhead. It doesn't mean that it's going to be this huge fill into posterior expansion, and that's why we use exercise to manipulate that to bias more fill. For example, I may get more posterior expansion at T2 to T4 if I tip someone upside down, because the lungs will feel superiorly to inferiorly, as opposed to when you're standing, it feels inferior to superior. So we have to think of this in terms of gradients. So I would potentially, if we're assuming normal mechanics, disagree with your colleague when we're talking about unloaded overhead activity. But now, here's the key contention point. Your friend also said that when you're under load, you're going to get increased compressive forces. And I would agree with that 1007%, which isn't even possible, I don't think. I'm going to keep it 1000 with you, though. With that, anytime I have to produce force, I need concentric activity of muscles to complete that action. And the heavier it goes, the more that demand increases of the tissues. So if I'm pressing hella weight overhead, which, good Lord, one, you're never going to see that from your boy, but two, if you do see me doing that, it's not going to be pretty. But if I were to do that, I'm going to need maximal or a substantial amount of concentric contraction of my tissues. So in that case, I actually may get a larger degree of compression or concentric activity in the posterior thorax, limiting my ability to expand. That's why a lot of times when you see someone doing like a heavy overhead press, they have to arch their back. And if you look back in the day when overhead pressing was an Olympic sport, you had these people who would do these deep arches for that reason. It's just because you can't get the expansion in that position. And when you get to more of a horizontal leverage, you can rely on passive tissues or make it more like a horizontal press. So I agree with your colleague there. The mechanics definitely change under load. This is probably one factor that contributes to people who pursue heavy loaded sports, powerlifters, bodybuilders, why they have more concentric bias, and that's because that's what they're training. To summarize your great question, Inyaka, unloaded, you will get some posterior expansion if we're talking about overhead mechanics just because of scapulohumeral rhythm. Fact check me, look at the Paula Ludwig article because she outlines basically that dynamic that I discussed. But when you're under load, you need more muscle tension to move them heavy ass weights. Hashtag Ronnie Coleman. You need that. So you're going to have more concentric activity or compression in areas to be able to complete the tasks. The mechanics change under load.